In the frozen forests of northern Russia, 100,000 German soldiers vanished from Hitler's maps, surrounded, cut off, left to die in temperatures of -40 degrees. No escape route, no relief army coming, just snow, starvation, and Soviet steel closing in from every direction. This is the story of the Demyansk pocket, the battle history almost forgot. By early 1942, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union had stalled. The lightning advance of 1941 was over. Hitler's armies were exhausted, overstretched, and facing a Soviet winter counteroffensive they had never prepared for. Along the entire Eastern Front, German units struggled to hold ground they had captured just months before. The war was changing, and not in Germany's favor. In January 1942, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive near Lake Ilmen in northwestern Russia. Within weeks, they had encircled two entire German corps, the 2nd and 10th, near the town of Demyansk. Over 100,000 men were trapped inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide. Hitler refused to allow a breakout. He ordered them to hold at all costs. Hitler declared Demyansk a fortress. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no breakout attempt. The encircled troops were ordered to fight in place and wait for relief. Senior commanders warned this was suicide. The men inside the pocket had supplies for only a few weeks. Without resupply, 100,000 soldiers would starve or freeze to death before any relief force could reach them. With ground supply routes completely cut off, the Luftwaffe was given an impossible mission: feed and supply 100,000 men entirely by air. Every single day, hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, and fuel had to be flown into the pocket. The Ju-52 transport aircraft became the lifeline of Demyansk. Without these planes, every man inside the pocket would die. Flying into Demyansk was a death sentence for many Luftwaffe crews. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns targeted every incoming transport. Pilots flew in blinding snowstorms at night, through temperatures that froze engines mid-flight. Dozens of aircraft were lost. Yet the flights continued because stopping meant the men on the ground would have nothing. Not food, not bullets, nothing. Inside the pocket, German soldiers fought for survival on two fronts simultaneously: against the Soviets pressing in from every direction, and against the Russian winter itself. Men dug into frozen earth with bare hands. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Yet somehow these soldiers held their defensive line week after week, month after month. When spring came, the frozen ground became something worse: an endless sea of mud. The Russian Rasputinity turned every road into a swamp. Supply vehicles sank to their axles and disappeared. Even tracked vehicles struggled to move. The mud of Demyansk swallowed trucks, artillery, and men. It was a battlefield where nature itself was the enemy, and nature was winning. German combat engineers worked around the clock trying to keep supply lines open. Every road had to be rebuilt. Every bridge had to be reinforced. Soldiers who had trained to fight were now knee-deep in mud, hauling timber and laying corduroy roads through swamps. For every kilometer of road completed, the mud destroyed two more. It was a war against the land itself. Bridge after bridge collapsed under the weight of supply convoys. Engineers built makeshift crossings from whatever timber they could find. Local forests were stripped bare to construct corduroy roads across the swamps. Men worked in freezing water under Soviet artillery fire without rest. Every crossing they built was a small victory, and every Soviet shell that destroyed one was a small catastrophe. To survive, the Germans transformed Demyansk into a fortress. Thousands of soldiers dug defensive positions, built bunkers, and erected log fortifications across the perimeter. In summer, this meant exhausting labor in heat and mosquito-infested swamps. In winter, it meant hacking through frozen ground with pickaxes. The pocket became a vast construction site, built by men who knew their lives depended on every log they placed. The sheer scale of the defensive works at Demyansk was staggering. Thousands of men labored daily to strengthen the perimeter. Every hill, every tree line, every frozen stream became part of the defense. Soviet attacks came in waves, sometimes 10, sometimes 20 assaults per day. Each one was beaten back. Each one cost lives. But the line held, barely, always barely. The Red Army did not simply wait for the Germans to starve. Wave after wave of infantry assaults crashed against the Demyansk perimeter. Soviet commanders threw entire divisions into the attack, determined to eliminate the pocket before a relief force could arrive. German defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, fought from their fortifications with whatever ammunition the Luftwaffe had managed to deliver. Every bullet counted. Inside the pocket, German commanders faced impossible decisions every single day. Where to send reinforcements when every sector was under attack simultaneously. How to distribute dwindling food supplies fairly. Whether to sacrifice one position to save another. General Walter von Brockdorff-Hohlefeld commanded the trapped forces with remarkable skill, holding together an army that had every reason to collapse. In late March 1942, German forces outside the pocket launched a relief operation. Fighting through Soviet lines across frozen swamps and dense forest, they pushed toward Demyansk against fierce resistance. After weeks of brutal fighting, they succeeded, cutting a narrow corridor through to the pocket. It was just 10 kilometers wide, but it was enough. The Rameshevo corridor had been opened. The Rameshevo corridor was a lifeline, but barely. So narrow that soldiers called it the neck. Soviet artillery could hit it from both sides simultaneously. Supply convoys raced through under constant fire. The road surface was primitive, the bridges makeshift. Vehicles broke down and had to be pushed aside to keep traffic moving. But supplies flowed in, and wounded men finally flowed out. Even with the corridor open, supplying Demyansk remained a nightmare. Motorized vehicles constantly broke down in the mud and cold. The Germans relied increasingly on horses to move supplies through impossible terrain. Thousands of horses died at Demyansk from exhaustion, from cold, from Soviet fire. For the soldiers inside the pocket, the sound of a horse-drawn supply wagon meant another day. They would not starve. The villages around Demyansk were destroyed one by one. Some burned in the fighting. Others were demolished deliberately to deny the enemy shelter. The civilian population, Russian farmers who had lived there for generations, fled or perished. What had been a quiet rural region became a wasteland of ash and shell craters. War erased everything that had existed before it arrived. The Demyansk pocket held for nearly a year, from February 1942 to February 1943. Over 100,000 men survived an encirclement that should have destroyed them. The Luftwaffe flew over 30,000 supply missions into the pocket. It was a remarkable feat of endurance, but the cost was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of German and Soviet soldiers died. And the lessons learned at Demyansk would soon be forgotten at Stalingrad. Demyansk was supposed to prove that encircled German forces could survive. Hitler took the wrong lesson. He believed Stalingrad could be held the same way. It could not. The men of the Demyansk pocket endured one of the longest sieges on the Eastern Front, and history barely remembers them. If this story deserves to be remembered, subscribe and watch our next video on the Eastern Front.